Thanks everyone for coming. Today I'm going to present the results of my dissertation research. And I won't have time to go over everything, but I'm going to touch on some of the key highlights and findings. For those of you who don't know me, actually, I'm just coming to the end of the PhD program and I defend next week. So this is summarizing what I found throughout the course of the PhD, and I look forward to your questions at the end. So as Peter said, my project was looking at the impacts of retail supply chains, and specifically Walmart in Nicaragua, and the impacts on agricultural sustainability and food security for farmers who are supplying Walmart in Nicaragua. Just to provide a bit of the context, multinational retail corporations are increasing in both size and reach, and they're consolidating within global supply chains. This is giving them buyer-driven power to be able to control what is happening on the ground in agricultural production. They're voluntarily incorporating social and environmental goals into their business operations, which is called corporate social responsibility. Interestingly, NGOs are increasingly partnering with companies like Walmart, and they're providing authority and legitimacy to the multinational retailer in international development circles. And what's particularly interesting is NGOs are increasingly working with corporations to implement their corporate social responsibility initiatives on the ground with farmers. What's unclear is whether corporate social responsibility, or CSR, is actually achieving any benefits for farmers on the ground. There's been some research looking at impacts on income, but very little work on what are the food security and agricultural sustainability impacts at the household level. So I bring together private governance literature and development studies literature. I draw on the both of them, try and bring them together and understand what is happening for farmers on the ground as a result of rising corporate governance of the food system, and specifically what are the terms on which farmers are engaging in these markets. So what is happening to link farmers with big companies like Walmart? And I look specifically at Walmart because for the last 15 years it's been consistently ranked the first or second largest company in the world. This is from 2016. And so its size makes it an interesting test of the effectiveness of corporate social responsibility. And Walmart is making these big CSR commitments. So this is taken from their global sustainability report, and they're claiming that they're contributing to sustainable agriculture in the world by supporting farmers in their communities and producing more food with fewer resources and less waste. And you can read here, they're actually claiming that their global scale, their size and their resources are enabling them to make change, and they say play a significant role in contributing to solutions on pressing issues of sustainable agriculture. Nicaragua is particularly interesting because it's the site of Walmart's direct farm program in Central America, which Walmart claims is their best-in-class model for sourcing directly from smallholder farmers and improving agriculture and food security. In Nicaragua, you have Walmart operating now more than 80 supermarkets within Nicaragua. You also have an interesting comparison with the local supermarket chain owned by a Nicaraguan family, La Colonia. And you also have vegetables being moved through traditional local markets, which provided control for my analysis looking at the supermarket supply chains. My results are specific to Nicaragua, but given that Walmart is now expanding into countries across the global south, provides some insight into what we might want to continue to look at as they're expanding elsewhere. So you see Walmart's now active, or has operations, which are retail outlets, in 28 countries, 25 of which are in the global south. And this is not including the many more suppliers that they source from in various other countries. And in Nicaragua, we're also seeing large international NGOs partnering with Walmart and working to link farmers to Walmart's operations and retail outlets in the country. And this is one of them, funded by USAID and Catholic Relief Services. And they're making claims that they are linking farmers successfully to produce what the market demands. I'll explain a bit more about cooperatives and their role later on when I talk about my findings. So the overarching research question of my study was, how and why does rising retail governance of the global agri-food system impact farmers' food security and agricultural sustainability on the ground? And I did this through some distinct entry points and points of investigation. So I have a series of distinct chapters that each make a contribution to the literature and then overall make an overarching conclusion and policy recommendations. So I looked at, first in the chapter 2, what are the impacts of selling to Walmart for farmers? And then I looked at how effective is Walmart's CSR program in Nicaragua? What is the role of NGOs and cooperatives in this supply chain? And how does Walmart's business practices interface with public policy within Nicaragua? And this leads to some conclusions at the end. So my methods included 9 months of fieldwork in Nicaragua, where I conducted interviews and household surveys. And the initial interviews, which were on farmers' experience with agricultural and specifically vegetable production, on their perceived advantages and disadvantages of different market channels. I used the data from these interviews to design the questionnaire in the field to be more relevant to the local context and some of the issues that initially had come up as particularly interesting and important in Nicaragua. I then designed the questionnaire and implemented it with a research team to 250 households. Some were farmers who had sold to Walmart at some point between 2006 and 2013. 2006 is when Walmart entered the country. And I also did the survey with farmers supplying La Colonia and farmers who had only supplied traditional wholesale markets and never the supermarkets. And the questionnaire looked at demographics, productive assets, household characteristics, land use, agricultural practices, food security impacts. And I coded and categorized the interview data and then analyzed the quantitative data with Tableau, which let me visualize some of the trends that I was seeing in my research. And then I used Stata to do some statistical analyses of the quantitative survey data. And I supplemented these methods with almost a year working at the International Labor Organization, where I was drawing on some of the initial findings from the dissertation to contribute to their policy and programming work on global supply chains and impacts in the rural economy. So for my first main chapter, what are the impacts for farmers of selling to Walmart? I contributed to the debate in the development studies literature over the impacts of new retail supply chains and what are the opportunities and challenges for farmers in developing countries. For the most part, research is focused on looking at whether farmers are included or excluded by these new retail chains, and there's been less attention to what are the actual impacts. So what I did was I conducted a regression analysis, 3 separate ones for food security, agricultural practices, and wealth impacts. And I looked at a number of different factors to decide to look at which ones were significantly associated with farmer food security. You can see that the highlighted ones are the factors that were significant. Selling to Walmart or any market had no impact on farmers' food security, was not significantly associated. Rather, it was whether they had a contract with a market, regardless of which one, how much land they have, whether they had irrigation, whether they had laborers. But the key point is Walmart had no impact on farmer food security. Then I looked at what factors contributed to whether or not farmers were adopting good agricultural practices. And it's a public certification system that the government of Nicaragua has. And I found actually that the model overall wasn't significant, and so that means none of these things were able to explain why farmers were getting good agricultural practices certification. And I'll come back to later what the reasons for this were. Perhaps most interestingly, I found that while farmer household wealth was influenced by whether they had more land, more labor, and NGO support, selling an additional year to Walmart actually was associated with a decrease in farmer wealth. So this raises some questions about the view that supermarket participation in supermarket supply chains is actually beneficial to farmers and is an effective path to development. This is kind of puzzling because the private governance literature says that big corporations should be able to use their buyer power to control what's happening at the farm level to achieve their CSR objectives. So in chapter 3, I asked, why is, or in this case isn't, Walmart's CSR program effective as a way to achieve their business goals and advance rural sustainability? I found that contrary to what some private governance scholars have posited, Walmart's not able to control farmers in Nicaragua. And since 2006, Walmart has doubled their stores in Nicaragua. They've increased sourcing locally from local farmers by 40%. But at the same time, my survey results show that farmers are steadily exiting the Walmart supply chain. I found that the same CSR tools that Walmart is using to try and gain control over its farmers are in fact accomplishing the opposite. So they're trying to get farmers to comply with specific product standards and also to sign contracts to continue to supply to Walmart. But I found that actually many farmers are quitting the Walmart supply chain because they're frustrated with the rejected products that these quality standards result in. So what happened is farmers can normally sell all of their harvest, all their tomato harvest, to the traditional market. But Walmart wants only tomatoes of a certain appearance, size, blemish-free product. So farmers sort their product on farm. Walmart collects the product that the farmers have separated from their harvest. They transport it to their collection center, which can be 100 kilometers away. Walmart then sorts through that product and calls farmers and says, we're only buying this much of what you sent us. Feel free to come in the next 72 hours and collect what we've rejected. Farmers can't, it's not cost efficient for them to go 100 kilometers to pick up a few crates of tomatoes, and they become extremely frustrated that whereas they could sell this on the traditional market and the product would be sold at various prices according to the different qualities of tomatoes, Walmart will just reject the product. And it didn't matter how much they rejected. If they rejected any at all, farmers were frustrated, and 20% of farmers said this is why they left the Walmart supply chain. Walmart's also using contracts, formal written contracts with some farmers to try and gain better control over a steady supply of product. But farmers are saying that Walmart's not actually adhering to their own agreements, and they're getting extremely frustrated and saying this is the reason why we're stopping selling to Walmart. So while some farmers are exiting because at that moment there's a higher price on the wholesale market, or because their cooperatives became unstable, which I'll go into later, I also found a significant reason is that they just don't want to sell to Walmart. And part of the explanation is that Walmart's CSR is actually not designed to create improvements for farmers. So while Walmart is claiming that the goal of their CSR is improve sustainable agriculture, in fact, no farmer I surveyed said that they got any training from Walmart on agricultural practices, and their quality requirements for their products are related to appearance and size and have nothing to do with safety or contamination. And in fact, lead to rejected produce, which Walmart ends up garbaging when farmers don't come collect it, whereas that would normally have been sold on the local market to local consumers. So I argue Walmart instead is viewing CSR, as you can tell from this quote, as a business tool to gain control and reduce costs by sourcing locally from local farmers. they're still trying to achieve this, but this is the ultimate motivation. And so this chapter reveals the limits of CSR, both as a business control strategy and also as a way to achieve development goals in the Global South. I was curious because cooperatives have been identified as a way to improve the relationship between retail supply chains. The idea being that farmers can work together to gain economies of scale, to gain access to inputs, as well as gain access to meeting the requirements of some of these bigger supermarket buyers. But there's also growing evidence in the literature that cooperatives don't always work to maintain relationships with big supermarket buyers. And I wondered, what is the case in Nicaragua? I found that similar to recent work on why some cooperatives are successful at maintaining relationships with buyers, farmer and farm characteristics do matter. So if a farmer is made up of cooperatives that have more land, more labor, are more highly educated, they tend to be more successful at selling consistently to a supermarket. But surprisingly, what I found is that in Nicaragua, cooperatives supplying Walmart were the ones that were becoming unstable, and cooperatives supplying the local chain La Colonia were consistently maintaining that relationship and had for 7 or so years. So it seems that beyond characteristics of the members themselves, we have to look further into power relations in the supply chain to see, and we find that corporate practices matter, and the specific business practices of what the buyer, the cooperative's connected to, matters. So you can see that, so La Colonia and Walmart, they both want cheap, high-quality product at consistent volumes, but they go about getting that in different ways. So La Colonia has generally one-year contracts with farmers through their cooperatives, with an assumption on farmers' part that La Colonia will continue to renew the contracts. They negotiate planting dates with the cooperative leadership to find dates that work for both the cooperative members and La Colonia's requirements. La Colonia also provided, and farmers really liked this, that they provided interest-free loans for cold storage and transportation, a truck for the cooperative, which members then paid back through their sales to La Colonia and didn't have to pay any interest on it. But most importantly, La Colonia only buys from co-ops. They don't buy from individual farmers, and they prefer this as their key strategy for gaining loyalty and sourcing and having larger volumes of quality product. Walmart, on the other hand, has shorter term contracts, which we saw had no guarantee of renewal and might even be breached. They give farmers a sheet that says you have to plant on this date. You have to transplant on this specific date and harvest on this date, and they don't negotiate. But even more detrimental to cooperatives is that they will bypass the cooperative. Well, they don't quite bypass the cooperative. They use the cooperative as a financial intermediary to access farmers individually. So you'd have a co-op of 25 farmers, but Walmart only buys from the 2 that can meet its requirements. But those farmers still need a bank account to be able to sell to Walmart because they only pay by check. The co-op has the bank account. So 2 farmers sell directly to Walmart. Walmart pays the co-op pays those 2 farmers, and it becomes of no benefit to the rest of the cooperative members. And something that was interesting in this relationship was the role of the NGOs, whereas they're usually seen as improving the situation for farmers, they were actually exacerbating this relationship. So they were linking the resource-poor farmers to Walmart via cooperatives. So Walmart initially didn't want to buy from cooperatives. They preferred to have more direct control over individual farmers, but farmers didn't want to sell to Walmart. So NGOs came to Walmart and said, well, we have this cooperative of these farmers, which are generally in a more vulnerable situation than the La Colonia cooperative farmers. And they said, Walmart, you should buy from this cooperative. Walmart said to me they decided it would be worth it even if they got just a couple of good suppliers out of it. So this is a photo of an NGO that actually, an NGO-assisted cooperative project that had fallen apart, and it had been for sale for quite some time. So I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit and skip this chapter so we have time to get to errands. So just briefly to go over what the overarching contributions of the project are. I found that to understand what's actually going on the ground for farmers, you have to look at the specific terms of participation and the power relations in the supply chain. And a key contribution of my work is that farmers actually have more agency than is generally assumed in the literature. You can see that the way they make decisions is impacting farmers' control over their supply chains. And something I didn't touch upon was also that the local government is making more improvements than we would expect. So I'll open now for questions and look forward to it. Yeah. Oh. The question was, did La Colonia also reject product? Farmers complained a lot less about rejected product from La Colonia. I think the explanation is that because they're buying from cooperatives, much of the sorting of product is happening at a cooperative-owned collection center, and farmers are there to see it, and they can collect the rejected product and what doesn't meet their requirements. And so I guess more than the rejected part, it was that it had already gone off with Walmart, and then they didn't buy what they carried off necessarily. They just rejected it from outside the site of farmers. And they felt that sometimes maybe it got damaged in the actual transportation of the product because Walmart had no investment in the actual product at that point. Right, so the question was if we see Walmart claiming that it's increased local procurement, why in my data are we seeing farmers exiting Walmart supply chain? And I didn't look at all farmers supplying Walmart, and I found farmers who were, Walmart wouldn't give me a list of who they were purchasing from in the country. So I found them through other means, including through NGOs that were aware of which farmers were supplying Walmart. And so I would say so while Walmart is increasing their local procurement by continually finding new farmers that will sell to them, I was looking at a specific group of farmers, and among that group they were exiting the supply chain. In terms of size.
Farmers are the same size.
Right.
But I mean that perhaps Walmart is encouraging large farmer production that are compliant with
So the question is it that the farm size is getting bigger versus number of farmers?
the smaller farmers that continue to product.
I tried to control for that to some extent in the regression, looking at whether whether land size had some impact, and it wasn't significant. So I don't think that is the main explanation. Yeah. What do you mean by how much of total production? No, I can't. So the idea is how much control over the Nicaraguan market, tomato market, does Walmart have? Is the question. They don't have. The majority of products still moves through the traditional wholesale markets. And so Walmart has increased their stores, but they have not yet. They don't dominate the tomato market.
So they tell you also order all local source or California?
No, the majority of the vegetables are now locally sourced, but it's just that the majority of consumers in Nicaragua still shop at a variety of other stores, not only Walmart stores. Yeah. So they have different retail units. They have some that are the air-conditioned supermarket you would see in Canada that are geared at the higher-end consumers in the major cities in Nicaragua. And then they do have kind of a lower-end format that is more widely spread around Nicaragua, but consumers still tend to go not only to these shops, but to the wholesale markets or to the kiosks that buy from the wholesale markets. Oh, we have two, so maybe Nathan and then.
I also work on similar problems in fisheries. One of the things that we're struggling with is certification schemes and that supply chain. And what we're trying to figure out within certification schemes around supply chain, where's the best place to certify? And I'm just struggling with that idea. Is it better to certify the producer where's the best level to certify it? Perhaps, I just don't know much about that responsibility is whether there's schemes to certify those appropriations or those responsibilities.
So the question is, where is the best place to certify along the supply chain, at the level of the company or at the level of the farmers? And I would say, so my master's work looked at the impacts of fair trade certification on farmers growing coffee in Rwanda. And fair trade does have an element of certifying the buyer as well as the on-the-ground practices. And it does seem to, while it has its limitations, it's considered perhaps more stringent than other certification systems for that reason. There's lots of still criticisms with that. And I didn't present the chapter today of the case of good agricultural practices certification in Nicaragua, which I found was interesting in the field. There is a global GAP certification, which generally it's assumed that the buyer, Walmart for example, will demand that farmers meet those certification standards, but I found they weren't prioritizing that in Nicaragua. And in fact, the local government or the Nicaraguan government had created its own public certification, which seemed to promising as being more effective. So it was government regulated, but it was voluntary. And it seemed to be making more difference to fill a void where buyers were not requiring or enforcing that farmers met particular standards. So I don't know if that helps. I don't have a real, solid answer for you, but it is an interesting question. There was actually one in the back here. Hadi? Yeah.
The cost organized a portfolio of products for consumption based on the destination. Or whatever the co-op is there, go back to the farm. But so you got some back from other sources, a whole bunch of stuff. The co-ops also an organizing mechanism for introducing a portfolio of products, which are not tabletop.
No, at this point, or the question was, are cooperatives working with a variety of products? And they're working with a variety of different vegetables, but so far they're not processing them in any way. They're only selecting from the raw vegetables and selling those as is. They're not yet advancing into any sort of processing. Thanks.